Welcome. I'm Rochelle Wilhite, the designated broker of Best Choice Realty, and I've got Candace and Shannon here helping me co-host tonight. We're going to be talking about the Washington State forms, the Form 17 and inspection changes in Washington. I don't know about you, if you're a listing agent, you probably are experiencing this a little bit with some newer buyer's agents that maybe have not been trained well. I know I personally have expected, to have this kind of confusion when they changed the Form 17, and they didn't change the Form 17 at all. It was just on the purchase and sale agreement, how it's written. And there's kind of a confusion, I think, with buyer's agents on what some of these terms mean. So we're going to go over that as well as inspection changes in Washington. I don't think it hurts to do a little review on this, just so everybody's on the same page, at least with Best Choice Realty. So these are, Shannon, do you want to go over what we got from Candace?
Yeah. So Candace was sending me screenshots because I was asking her about this today. And we've got on here, these are separate people, separate marketplaces. I mean, they're not necessarily in all, they're not in the same area where they're competing against each other even. So these are very different types of agents, but they both had questions about the information verification period that's on the first page of the purchase and sale. It's term 15 now. For those that remember, this used to be during COVID. This was section W, where people were doing cross-offs and things like that during COVID, when they were waiving everything and giving their firstborn child to get a house. So they had questions about this, and these are agents that are fairly new, I would say, to the industry, but they both had questions and they both were confused on what this term means. So first one says, hey, I have a question regarding item 15 of Form 21. We have 3 days filled in on the form for information verification period. Can we do a pre-inspection during those 3 days? Seller had a pre-inspection form signed. The other person had, hi, Candace, I spoke with you on Monday about our property.
Let's stop there. Sorry, Shannon. Let's deal with the question. The simple answer to the text is no. That's the answer to the question. But I think it begs the question on why is that? We'll go into that in later slides on why that is the case. But the simple answer is, even though the sellers had a pre-inspection agreement signed and you're mutual, and you only have 3 days on the verification period, that's not for inspection. Form 17 and verification of the Form 17 is separate. It's not even part of the contract. That's a separate disclosure between seller and buyer. So I'll kind of show you on the paperwork, but the simple answer is no, that's not a pre-inspection for 3 days if you've got mutual acceptance already.
Yep. And then the second one is of the same kind of vein, where it's saying offer was accepted. I have a 10-day information verification contingency. The listing agent's firm is now asking for a Form 35W. So they must not have had a 35 or a 35W in their offer, waiving the inspection. I want to be sure, and I know it cut off there, but it's basically saying, I thought I could do an inspection. And I, just like with the seller, you can't do an inspection within that time period unless you have an inspection contingency. So we'll go into this here in a second. I think we've got some visuals, right, Rochelle?
We do. Yeah.
So I think it's worth reiterating too, especially for some of our newer agents, and you'd be surprised even some of our experienced agents have to be reminded of this sometimes, but when is a buyer allowed to go inside of a house? When are they allowed to go inside and preview it, inspect it, whatever? So when they can actually even go inside, obviously a private showing with an agent, they can go through for an open house. Once they've got their offer accepted, there's really only 2 other instances where they can go inside that house. And that would be for an inspection with an inspector, or for the final walkthrough, which is not an inspection. Some people, we had an agent who's been, he does a lot of business, and he had a client who wanted to bring an inspector to the final walkthrough, and you can't do that. You can certainly have them re-inspect some of the things that came up on during their inspection, to verify that some of the work orders that they had asked for were completed, but it's not for an inspection. That's not the purpose of the final walkthrough.
And the final walkthrough, before you move on, Shannon, I think what's confusing about the final walkthrough is that if you had a Form 35, not a 35W, and then you had the final walkthrough clause is in the purchase and sale agreement. They're two separate things. So when you have a 35 that allows you to do a re-inspect, that's part of it. But a lot of you are thinking that you can do a final walkthrough and have the inspector come out and do like a final inspection. But what you're not understanding is that it's not tied to that. It's only tied to the Form 35. It's not tied to the 35W. There's not a section unless you had done a pre-inspection and you'd identified some things and there was some re-inspect needed there. But if you waive the inspection, that doesn't give you the right to have an inspector come in on that. And it says you have 5 days prior to closing to do a final walkthrough. That does not engage the inspector in that section of the purchase and sale.
Yeah, the purpose of the final walkthrough is not to inspect the home. It's more just to kind of check a couple different things where it's like if there were repairs that were requested, making sure that they're completed or done up to satisfactory standards. Or also, for me, whenever I've done final walkthroughs, I'm making sure that that seller is either in the process of moving out or has already moved out. But also they haven't damaged anything as well during the course of moving out. We've had some issues certainly come through. I know Rochelle's pipeline too, where the floors got damaged or the client literally had painted or they were, something was hidden behind the couch or something like that. Some sort of latent defect. So the purpose
mainly
of
final walkthrough is to, some people ask me, what do you do, Rochelle, when you do a final walkthrough? I don't make it a big deal. This is not an inspection. You're literally going to go walk through the house and make sure that the heat cranks on. That's probably a big deal, right? Especially if we get into the winter, the heat cranks on. That you can, if there's air conditioning, crank that on, make sure that the material things like Shannon's talking about, that the garage door opener works, run the garage door opener, flush the toilet, make sure that the appliances are connected. That's it. And you're walking through just to get excited. That's usually the place where people are measuring the front door to see how they're moving, how their moving truck is going to be able to back up into it's that kind of final thing. This is not meant to renegotiate the contract. That's not what the final walkthrough is for. It's very rare that we're going to have things that come up. And Shannon, you brought up a kind of a good question is like, what if there is something like on the wall? Like that's not addressed in the contract. Once you get to this stage, you're buying the home. You've already signed your final paperwork. You're not renegotiating. Oh, there's a paint swatch that doesn't match another paint swatch. That's not what this is for. That should have already been addressed at the onset.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, it's the whole purpose of this visual to kind of go through for you guys is just to remember that this is the opportunity for your client to go through the house. Other than that, they would need special permission from the seller to go through that property. There's not really any other contingencies other than, septic. I think Rochelle is the only one I can think of where they could potentially attend that inspection, but that's outside, where they could actually be at that property. So information verification is certainly not one of them. Form 17 is not anything like that. These would be the only items for them to attend or go inside that house.
Before we move to, let's go back one step. I also want to make sure it's very clear. There are, because of where we are as a firm, and we are very much the number one, Best Choice Realty was nominated by the Seattle Times, which puts us kind of on the spotlight. And it's a good thing for most of the time, but there are a lot of people from other companies that want to send you in for complaints. So I'm glad you guys are attending today, because when you allow a buyer to access the interior of the home without the contract, you run the risk that you could be looking at a fine with Northwest MLS. So improper use of key box, allowing people to be in the property without permission, without the written permission, those are concerns. And I've had to, both Shannon and I have had to deal with those complaints, and hopefully they don't go all the way through. But we have had a couple that have been some close calls, and I think it's very important that we go over when a buyer is allowed to go inside the house. And if you're going inside a house, you're allowing somebody, you can't let them go in by themselves. That's the other thing that I think we need to remind ourselves. You have to go follow the instructions on the agent remarks and use your key and make sure that you properly secure and lock the doors when you're done.
Yep.
There are some security things we've had to get involved with as well. So
yeah. And it comes up all the time. I was out showing homes even this last weekend where the key box was not working. And, it was a vacant house, had been on the market for a long time. The clients were kind of putting around because we had an appointment and, the window is undone or the slider is open or whatever. And it's like, let's call the agent. You can't leave an unsecured property. They need to be aware of it and things like that to make sure you're under, we have to do our due diligence to make sure the houses are secured, but then also we're following the rules. So leaving business cards when you're showing the house, not leaving an inspector or client in the house, you have
unattended.
to be there.
Yep.
Yeah. For the duration of the showing, and making sure you have a confirmed appointments. You're following the instructions within the agent remarks, and not all of them have showing time, but if they do, make sure you have that on there. And if you're late, I think this also kind of puts a bad taste in some agents' mouth too, is if you're late for your appointments or you just straight up don't show, just cancel it or something so that they at least notify. Otherwise they will be more prone to call you out on other things.
Or they can submit a complaint, and that's
Yep.
unfortunate. That some of
Yeah.
them I can defend, others I really can't. So you guys can watch yourselves when you're out there representing Best Choice Realty for inspections, but also for showings. Let's go to the next slide.
Yeah.
So yeah,
So
this is the
the
part. This
term.
is term
Yeah.
15.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Yeah.
Shannon.
Yeah, and they moved this. So earlier, you can see this is the revision date of the Form 21 as July 2023. So this used to be, it wasn't on the first page prior to July. This used to be just on Section W. And so we would see, for those veterans out there, we would see a lot of people crossing it out or they change it or whatever. They moved it on the first page of the purchase and sale. And the intention behind this is to put everything front and center on the first page, eliminating cross outs and things like that too, to make it a little bit cleaner for a contract. But by and far, if you leave it alone, I think we've got the visual on here too, for where the Section W is. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you don't select anything, you leave it alone, the default is still that 10 days. So this is where you could potentially tighten up a contingency and maybe put, I don't know, 2 days, 3 days, whatever. Or you can select satisfied, wait if they feel pretty good about it, those types of things. So I think, Rochelle, you wanted to talk about how this relates to Form 17 a little bit.
Yeah, just give me one sec. So I think what is confusing is there was not a change to the actual Form 17 document. In fact, there wasn't a change to even the language. It just, like Shannon said, put it on the first page. But then there's some confusion on, okay, well, I'm in a situation where I'm in a multiple offer situation. Or Rochelle, there is not a multiple offer situation. My advice to you is if you're not in a multiple offer situation, the default is sufficient. And that gives proper amount of time for a buyer to speak with their attorney, speak with their dad, who might have more knowledge about the Form 17. Maybe it's a first-time home buyer that's a little bit jittery and wants to make sure that they get their questions answered about the property or how the seller answered the questions on the Form 17. The default would be your best case if you're not in a multiple offer situation. If you're in a multiple offer situation, that's where you need to consider what type of multiple offer situation, what type of property. And so that's where you may want to cut things down, like Shannon's suggesting, or waive it. But very rarely, if you guys can stop waiving it, if you waive it, that doesn't give me anything to go off of if I'm trying to help you in exiting a contract, or if we find something out that's material different on the Form 17. The attorney, unfortunately, if you waive on here and you waive on the Form 17, it's pretty tight. There's not ways to wiggle out of the contract. So as a listing agent, you might want that. But also you got to think from a buyer's point of view as well. And so kind of think about that on term 15. Nothing really changed. It's just, it's front and center, and it notifies the parties of how much time you have to ask questions about the seller's disclosure. Okay, so that's the section right here. It was always 10 days if not filled in. It was built in, it was 10 days. So now you may want to cut it down depending on how much time you need to review the Form 17, but it's an information verification period. It's not a way to easily back out. In fact, it requires much more legal insight on utilizing this information verification period to terminate a contract. So don't think that if you have, cut that down to 3 days or 10 days, there still may be an opportunity for you to go seek an attorney to give advice on whether that Form 17 was filled out in its entirety or correctly. This is just for verifying some of the answers to the seller's disclosures. So if I was representing a buyer, say Shannon had a home that she was selling, and she had filled out a Form 17 completely, everything was checked, everything was properly done. Maybe we don't have a Form 17 we can pull up, but let's just say on Section 7, she indicated that there was a defect with the furnace, but she didn't answer the question in its entirety, where I'm trying to verify what she said about the furnace. She said it wasn't working and sometimes it's spotty. She didn't give enough information for me to make an educated decision on whether I wanted to move forward with the purchase and sale. So then as a buyer's agent, I would contact my buyer and say, what questions do you have about the furnace, or how Shannon answered that Form 17 question. They said, Rochelle, we want to get, we're going to waive the inspection, but we want to make sure that we get some more information from the seller about that type of system that she's using on the furnace. It sounds like it's all fixed, but we want to get some verification on whether that furnace was fixed appropriately. Certainly always want to recommend that they get an inspection. But in this case, they want to waive the inspection. They just want more information. So I would, in writing, send Shannon an email during this information verification period saying, hey, my buyer would like more information about the furnace that you have, how you've answered the furnace on Section 7 of the Form 17. Could you please provide me receipts or more information about the work that was done to the furnace? Then Shannon would have to go ahead and get me that information in that information verification period. That's what that verification period is all about. It's getting a buyer and seller to communicate with each other and to verify what the seller has indicated on the Form 17 is sufficient for the buyer, and make sure that there's that period of time. So if they're okay with the way that the seller has answered all the questions, then you may not need all 10 days to get the verification on the way that they've answered those questions. Okay, so the agreement will terminate. So there is a way to exit if the verification is not appropriately done. This receipt is in addition to that process. So this is the last page of the Form 17 that indicates 1, 2, and 3 on how you are receiving the disclosure and also waiving the right to revoke the offer. So this is in conjunction. It's not in conjunction, it's separate. There's a waiver period, or how you're receiving the disclosure, and then there's a verification. They're two separate things. In term 1, this is where we receipt. So in a normal standard transaction where we have buyer wanting to use their verification timeline, that would be appropriate just to have them sign the receipt. It's only when we are wanting to waive the right to revoke the offer, we want to not have 3 days to terminate the contract for any reason, where we would have the buyer sign on number 2. So in a multiple offer situation, where we are maybe reviewing during that pre-purchase and sale agreement timeline, and we were putting 0 or waiving the Form 17, we also may want to consider, in order to show the sellers we've done our due diligence ahead of time, that's when we would use number 2 sparingly, where we'd sign off on number 1 and sign off on number 2. It's improper to have the buyer sign 1, 2, and 3. It's only time we use number 3, again, even more sparingly than 1 and 2, is when the seller is in a foreclosure, when we have never received the Form 17 yet, we are going to proceed with the closing. That is a complete waiver and should be used very, very rare. In fact, you might want to call me if you have never used number 3 and you're wanting to go over what the harm is, what are the risks by doing number 3. Most of the time, number 2, if number 2 is not signed, a buyer could basically get under contract. We could play this out with Shannon. Say Shannon, same example, Shannon had a Form 17 and she indicated a few things on the Form 17. If I wanted to cut that timeline down from 10 days on the review to 3 days, I could basically run it in tandem with this process, where I could have the buyer just receive it and then have 3 days to make sure everything is suitable. And then automatically it's waived after 3 days. but however, I changed my mind. Like I got more information during that information verification, or my dad just said, you know what, Rochelle, I don't think this is a good buy. I don't have to give any reason if I don't sign number two, and I can send a notice, and it's 90A, to go ahead and terminate the contract and get out of the deal. And there's no reason needed. It's just based on the disclosure law. And that's only if I'd only signed number one. If I have signed off on number two, I don't have that 3-day right to revoke my offer and get out of the deal. So that's kind of the reason why listing agents are in a multiple offer situation, are looking for the buyer to have done their disclosure review, cut down their review period, and then also potentially waive the right to revoke their offer, to keep that deal moving swiftly and not run the risk that the buyer is going to terminate for any reason.
Yeah, and I
This
think
is
that
different.
for the contract nuts out there, it says it on here too. On this line 285 says, unless otherwise agreed in writing, buyer shall have 3 business days from the day seller delivers this disclosure statement to rescind the agreement by delivering a separate signed rescission to seller. So that's that 90A that Rochelle is talking about. You have those 3 days to review it. And if you don't agree with it, you have that right to back out. If not, then you proceed to closing.
I'll fall on the sword a little bit, Shannon. So when I got my Washington license, when I came back to Washington and I opened my firm, it was like the first listing that I did, and a buyer's agent backed out and sent me the 90A to terminate. And I got so upset because I was like, everything was going fine. And so I even called the Northwest MLS to find out, like, is that possible? Can they do that without reason or cause? And that's right there on the Form 17. I had to read it and I'm like, reread it and go, yeah, they don't have to provide any reason to
Yeah.
rescind by only signing number one. So that's kind of the reason why you want to make sure that everybody's good with it. It's not practice, it's not common practice in just a standard transaction where there's, negotiation, to have the buyer waive their right. In fact, it's kind of nice to have that. It runs in tandem, especially if you have an inspection period. You have 3 days for the Form 17 to right to revoke, and then also you have whatever timeline you have on the inspection. So I wouldn't be so worried about it unless you're in a multiple offer situation. Then one situation might serve the seller better than another situation.
Yeah.
That's where you want to look strongly at this
And
section.
that's appealing too. I mean, as a listing agent, when you look at it and you're looking at all the different contingencies and you see a buyer and they've aligned the Form 17, they've only signed for term 1, but they also only have a 3-day inspection contingency too, which is probably, I would say, about the average right now for inspection time frame. Is usually 3 to 5 days is what most people are putting on right now, if they're doing inspections. But if you have everything aligned on that 3 days, it's like, well, I can basically go to my seller and say, we'll know in 3 days whether or not they want to proceed or not.
Yeah.
Like, there's not really any other, contingency other than maybe financing or septic or something like that. But you'll know very clearly, very quickly. And that seems to work and works very nicely to convey
I think
that.
it shows that the contract, you know your contract, right? And
Yeah.
you can kind of look at this with your buyer and just say, you know what, I know this is kind of an uncertain times, but we're going to make this as certain as we possibly can for that seller. We might be beating them up on price, but let's cut our timelines down. Let's get this contract so it makes it very easy for the listing agent to go to their seller and say, hey, they're asking for 10,000 in closing costs, and they've cut their timelines down from 10 days to 3 days, and the disclosure to 3 days. I mean, this agent knows what they're doing. So there's some strategy around how you craft this, but it also is your knowledge base on how the difference between the Form 17 and also the inspection. And again, the Form 17, just as a reminder, it is separate. It's not part of the purchase and sale agreement. It's not a contingency. You have an inspection contingency. You don't have a Form 17, in essence, built into the contract. You just have a review where you can ask questions with the seller.
Yeah. And I suppose while we talk on this is kind of fresh in my mind, at least right now. The Form 17 is separate. She just said that it's separate from the purchase and sale. And so much so that when you're delivering it to another agent or the lender or escrow, it's best to keep them separate. And the lender does not get a copy of the Form 17. That is a disclosure between buyer and seller. So learn from many other agents' mistakes that we've encountered. For me, it was the other agent on a deal, one side, they sent it to the lender, and I was like, why did you do that? Because the lender and the underwriter now are going to go through that Form 17 if you send it to them.
I think the one you're referring to, Shannon, is the underwriter called out the electrical panel.
Yeah.
And so if they wouldn't have done that, yes, I mean, we have a duty to disclose that, but the buyer was willing to take that on and have their own contractor and do it and get it done. But because the Form 17 was sent by the buyer's agent, now we have to do all of that work, and we have to go through the underwriting process and get the appraiser to come back out. It was a major, major hassle that didn't need to be done just by simply putting the Form 17 and making that in our office file between buyer and seller and separate from the purchase and sale agreement. And
yeah, so just being careful, I suppose. It gets busy and it's so easy just to hit the forward, but just take the extra time to separate it out when you're sending that, like, hey, it's mutual to everybody, escrow, lender, other agent, the office, whatever. Just separate out that Form 17 and only send it to the parties that need to see it.
Perfect. Good. All right, let's go to the next. So inspection contingency. So this is a reminder. I don't want you guys, we have had close calls. In fact, we actually had to do a dead deal and we were able to settle things out. The earnest money actually got settled out between the two parties, luckily. But I mean, this all stemmed from misunderstanding. One of our agents misunderstood that if she gives any portion of the inspection report to the seller in conjunction with the negotiations without those boxes being checked on 4B, you've waived your inspection contingency. And that means, unfortunately, if you needed 10,000 in closing costs or you were negotiating, money in lieu of repairs, that also waives that as well. So be very careful. They changed this back in July of last year, or early this year, right? Is that where it was? July?
No, they added this last year. Before, right before the market started to shift a
That's
little
right.
bit. And so the change was put into effect before we really were seeing inspections. And so now we're actually starting to see the impact of this change, fast forward a year, when they made this change from the forms committee at the Northwest MLS. So just be careful. It is, Rochelle's right. This is, you can get in hot water very, very swiftly. What I typically do and what some of our more experienced agents are doing in habit when you're representing a buyer is just saying, here's what we're requesting. If you would like to see some more information, please send over a 35C and I'm happy to provide segments of the report, pursuant to that.
Or some people, Shannon, alternatively have, like, depending on the property and how their buyer is going to want to negotiate, they're going to ask for this upfront in the negotiations, right? Where they're going to check the box saying, if the buyer requests repairs, the seller's they're going to embed it so we don't have to even do the 35C. If the box is checked on 4B, then yes, you can go back to negotiate like we did back in the old day. But we're getting a lot of resistance around that process. So I think Shannon's idea of you doing the 35C, and if you get to that point, just knowing that there's a form for that and you have to actually get their written permission to provide any portion of the report. That goes from like a contractor bid to what was the other one I got? A text message. I wanted to send them a picture of like the roof. No, that's a portion of the report. So anytime you think I'm going to just send this to help the negotiation, it actually could be seen by that other company or that other firm that is an automatic waiver. And there is nothing better than that gives them pleasure, especially with something that needs $10,000 worth of work, to just say, oh, sorry, you guys have waived, and you're going to proceed to escrow as outlined in the contract. So just be very careful on that. That's something that is hot right now for a lot of brokerages.
I would say too, we're starting to see, at least I'm starting to see a little bit of a trend too, where buyers agents they're getting bids for things. Sometimes if they're extending their inspection time period, they're getting bids for things. And they're specifically using contractors that are going to inflate the amounts so that they can negotiate further on inspections. So if you're representing the seller, it is probably a good habit to maybe shop the bid, get a second opinion. Use that time when they're asking for additional time or when you're responding to get someone else to give you a second opinion, because sometimes they're going to inflate it, asking for $20,000 in reduction in price when in reality it's only a $5,000 bid or a $10,000 bid or something like that.
But I mean, the electrical panel, Shannon, that we had to do,
yeah,
the buyer's agent got 5 bids, and we were able to get a bid that was half of what
yeah,
they were coming in at.
yep,
So that was unfortunate that that went that way. But I mean, that took an extra week. We were crunched for time at the very end of the transaction. The seller and the buyer were a little bit, unhappy with how, and again, that all stemmed because Form 17 was given to the underwriter. I'm on that
yeah,
electrical panel. So we were crunched, but that additional time for inspections, I think that's important to know that people are just getting those to fly. So if you're cutting the buyer's notice on number 3 to, like, say 3 days, just realize that it actually is not 3 days. Most inspectors are going to find something that will need additional time for inspection. So if you're representing the seller, you're like, I need to keep this thing buttoned up, or maybe maybe we've got another buyer coming in, that might be in the wing. You might want to counter them on term 5, and because it's just additional time. Basically, it's 5 more days in addition to the 3 days supposedly in term 3, if you're cutting that down. So you're looking at a week, even
yeah,
with
or
that.
more. Yeah, I mean, I was in a situation where a buyer, this is actually fairly recently, they found extensive mold in the attic. And obviously, it's not a position that we like to be in, is to find really, really hazardous mold in the attics. And they had a 10-day inspection, and it was around a holiday, so it was actually more time even then. And they had additional time. We left it alone for 5 days. So I mean, at the end of the day, they had 15 days for an inspection, which as a buyer's agent is great. But as a seller, it's like, oh, that's almost 2 weeks. That could be the difference between a summer market and a fall market, or you could lose some traction with holidays and things like that too. So keep that in mind.
Okay, very good. I think that was it. Candace, did you have anything else to share? Did we hopefully answered the questions on the text messages? You probably want to go back. I think the one we definitely answered. The second one, I think we covered as well, but please speak up.
No, that was great. I think you guys covered that and a little bit more. So excited to even just have you reiterate on the Form 35 as well. I would also just say, be careful too when writing up your inspection responses. That I just actually recently ran by one that they just kind of cut and paste from the inspection report.
Yep.
And the words that a inspector is going to use is, recommended. Be clear. I think it's probably safer to kind of re-verbiage the inspector's comments as opposed to cutting and pasting, because sometimes they're just recommend that the person does a inspection and repair. So be aware of what you're cutting and pasting as well.
Don't just copy and paste like recommend, because that's not what we're asking for the seller to do something.
Do the actual repair.
The 2 words I always like is remedy. I love the word remedy. So that would be the word you would want to replace with recommend. Seller to please remedy the handrail. That would be remediating something, means you have to fix and replace. So be careful on your words. I think you're right, Candace. I think I see a lot of recommend, and that's not what we're doing in 35R. We're actually asking the seller to do something. So be very clear about what they need to do.
Yeah.
Oh, Sabat had a question. Sabat, go ahead.
Yes. So on one of my offers, my client wanted to do inspection. It is a multiple offer situation, and the listing agent said, okay, you guys, my client wanted to do inspection, but it's only for information purposes. On that case, when they counter us back, they crossed out the second page when we can ask for more information.
Okay.
And I just want to verify that my clients still come back out if they didn't like what they see on the inspection. We have
As long as they didn't cross off term 1 of Form 35, Sabat, that would
Okay.
be fine. I have seen a counter where they end up on that other section you're referring to where they cross that off, that they put zeros.
Yeah.
Essentially, they did the same thing. They zeroed out that section of the contract. So you do have on term 1, it says very clearly that if you
Yeah.
give notice within that window of time, that you can exit the contract. So as long as term 1 was not crossed off, you are okay.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah,
Yep.
and I think it's worth also just mentioning, Rochelle. So what would you say is the best way to indicate either a pass-fail inspection or a information only kind of inspection? What's the best way to handle something like that for a buyer?
I think it's best to communicate that with the listing agent. Using the Form 35 as the vehicle, we certainly would want to counter. If I was a listing agent and in Sabat's case, I probably would have done the same thing, but I would probably not crossed out. Anytime you cross something out, that makes like, did we initial it? Who triggered that? Why are they practicing law? Who advised them to do that? Did their attorney? I mean, so in order to avoid that, it would be better just leave the form alone and then just indicate, like some of you have done in like the 22D other, this is I think Candace, you have something you use, right? You want to share what you use?
I actually, on the Form 22D in the other section, I just put Form 35 for information verification purposes only, and pass fail. And that's it.
And that's a way you're communicating. Now, does an attorney like that language? Not
No.
really, but I mean, think as agents, we understand that, and I would much rather have the inspection contingency used and cut down. So if you most likely are cutting down your inspection contingency to like 3 days, and you're probably
5
cutting
at
down.
most, yeah.
So that would be the better way to communicate that, I think, than crossing stuff off the contract. But if you get a counter offer like that and Sabat has a question, that's what I'm here for. If you've got questions related to the contract or the counter offer, I'd rather hear from you than having an interpretation and then we have a battle with the other firm where they're saying, no, that's not what it meant. That's not what we meant. We meant that they were going to waive their inspection. But as long as term 1 is intact, you're going to be just fine. So that's great.
All right. Thank you.
You bet. All right. Well, that's a wrap for tonight. Thank you so much for jumping on. If there was any other questions, you're welcome to text me or call me. Hopefully that was helpful for some of you. Just a quick review. Awesome. Shannon, anything else that we need to cover?
Yeah, no, I think we covered everything that we promised to cover and a little bit more. So thanks you guys for popping on. And we've got a great training later this week and next week. So stay tuned for those. Should be lots of fun. And then good luck with your offers. If you need help, call Candace, call me, call Rochelle. It's busy out there, surprisingly, but it's busy. There's a lot of business to be had right now. We just have to kind of hunt for it a little bit more than we've used to in the last couple of years, but lots of opportunities for sure.
Okay. Have a good one. See you guys soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.